Oh, with my big, dirty, ugly feet. That's nice.
Anita, that's now captured.
Okay, so stories over the millennia have become the foundation of cultures. Stories known by the cultures known by the stories they tell. Like the Greeks, of course, their myths of the gods and the heroes and stuff that have cemented themselves in history and in a cultural world. The connections between different cultures can be shown through these stories. Like when you look at all the stories of all the cultures of all the world, you can see there are certain types of stories that are always there. Like the flood myths, they're all over. Like with the Greeks, you have delusion and Phira, Noah and the Ark for the Hebrew Bible, and Nicaragua has the indigenous people there. They have myths about this great flood that came and they had to rebuild completely from scratch. Now, these connections of stories, they can be linked to Jung's theory of the collective unconscious. This is actually where he got his inspiration in order to do this. Because he saw that in every single culture there are certain types of stories and there are certain parts of stories that are true in every story. Like you have the shade or the shadow, which is the villain of the story, or you have the wise old man or the wise old woman, which is in many, many stories. And with this, Jung believed that there was an unconscious mind that all of humanity shares, and it caused all these separate cultures to have these same type of stories. Now, this includes the flood tales that I mentioned earlier, but it also includes the quest type tales. Tales of like Odysseus making his way home from the Trojan War, or the epics of Gilgamesh as he's battling all these monsters. But it also includes tales that are reminiscent of like Beauty and the Beast, where you have that French fairy tale which is based off of an earlier Greek tale of Cupid and Psyche, and there is an ancient Chinese tale that follows the exact same pattern of the beautiful girl falling in love with the monster and changing him back with her love into the handsome prince that he was. Now, what does this all mean? This could, as Jung believed, it be indicative of this unconscious mind that everybody shares, or it could also be indicative of the evolution of storytelling and the evolution of story itself. Now, story can change over time. During the Columbian Exchange, there were trades and goods that were going from Europe over into the Americas, and goods from the Americas going back over to Europe and spreading into the Far East and Africa. But you also have stories that are taken with these sailors and from these indigenous people in the Americas back over. And so that could link those stories. That could be the reason why that we have these different cultures that have the same stories. Because a culture likes this one story that they've found over in America, they could bring it back and change it to their own will and make it fit their culture and become their own, and forget over the years that it wasn't originally their own story. Now, this leads to the changing of stories. An example of this could be the golden apple versus the story of Snow White. Now, in the myth of the Trojan War, the very beginning of it was caused in part by the gods. There was a marriage up on Olympus, and the goddess Eris, the goddess of discord, was the only one who was not invited to this wedding, this blowout feast. And she, in turn, took a golden apple that said, "For the fairest," and threw it amongst all the goddesses and the nymphs and all of these creatures, and she just walked away. Now, every single goddess decided that that apple was for herself. And so there was this huge fight, and it was narrowed down to Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And of course, they wanted Zeus to decide who was the fairest and who should get the honor of the apple. Now, of course, this led to Paris deciding, being named the judge to decide. And of course, the goddesses, being wonderful, moral creatures like they were, bribed Paris into choosing them. And Aphrodite, of course, was the one who won, and she promised Paris the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, which, of course, at the time was Helen of Sparta, also known as the face that launched 1,000 ships. Now, when you compare this to Snow White, which is a story of a queen who's jealous of her stepdaughter, who is now, as she has grown, has become the fairest in the land. And she takes this apple, the poisoned apple, to Snow White to kill her so she could become the fairest in the land. So you have these major plot devices in these two stories, in the apple and in the hopes to become the fairest in the land, the fairest of all. And you have these main aspects of the story. Now, when you think about where these stories come from, one is predates the turn of the millennia, from BC into the CE, and you have that change from way back when, before the time of the Trojan War, to not modern, but around medieval times, Germanic area. And you have this separation of geography and of time. And so that lends to the idea that there is an evolutionary process in these stories, and that connects everybody throughout the globe, because you have such distances separating these two stories that are so similar. And leading all of these together, the archetypal stories, how you have like the flood tales, all of these different main plot-line stories that are present in every single culture, unifies the world in the sense that all of our cultures are the same, in a sense, because all of our stories are the same. And since stories are the foundation of our cultures, that shows that there is this final unity between all of humanity, which would go back to Jung's theory of the collective